very warm welcome to you. And thanks a lot for joining us for this second in our Masterclass series. My name is David Hines, and I'm a senior manager here at Gold Standard. And I'm delighted to welcome you to today's session. So last week, we were lucky to be joined by Pablo Fernandez, who's the CEO of EcoSecurities. And he walked us through, in a little over 2 hours, more than 2 decades worth of developments and evolution of the carbon market. And Pablo was telling us about the different phases that we've moved through. And the last of those phases that we focused on was the Paris Agreement phase. And Pablo introduced a little bit as to what are some of the changes actually that were brought about by the Paris Agreement. And we had a number of participant questions and quite a lot of interest in these changes, and in particular, what it means for developing projects under Article 6.2 and Article 6.4. So we're really thrilled that we're going to be able to dive much deeper into this particular topic today as we look at project development under the Paris Agreement. And before we get going, I just want to say a thank you to the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action, whose support has made this Masterclass series possible. So we are joined today by a super team from Perspectives Climate Group, who's going to walk us through the topic, and I'm going to introduce them in a moment. But before we do so, we would like to get a sense of who's in our audience. Now, last week we had some issues with our survey. I'm hoping it's going to work this week. So you should see now a QR code on your screen, which if you have a phone handy, you can scan, and that should take you to a form. And there are a couple of questions on that form. If you submit the responses, and then hopefully we should see who's joining us in our session today. Okay, so it looks like we've got a lot of people from Germany, but also the UK, India as well. So we've got a good geographical spread of people. What kind of organization are you working for? So we have quite a lot of project developers, 40% of our audience. And then we have a split between consultancy and those of you who are joining us from other professions. That's good to see. And where do you rate your knowledge? So roughly in the middle. And so perhaps you're a little bit familiar with Article 6, but you're here to expand that knowledge, and there's an awful lot that we can actually dive into in the topic. So I think that's to be expected, and I think you're probably going to get a lot out of today's masterclass. So thank you very much for taking part in that form. It also helps our presenters know who they are speaking to in our audience. And with that, we should get on to the main event. So as I mentioned before, we have 3 great speakers from Perspectives Climate Group, and 40% of you are project developers. And for anyone who's being active in the carbon markets, for sure you will already have heard of Perspectives. And so we have 3 colleagues who are joining us today. So I'm just going to introduce them in turn, and then I'm going to hand over to them. So firstly, we have Hanna-Mari Ahonen, and she's a senior consultant at Perspectives with more than 20 years of experience in international carbon markets, where her focus has been on safeguarding environmental and social integrity. And her experience spans project development, the climate negotiations under the UNFCCC, and she's advised on both compliance and voluntary markets. Joining her is Juliana Kessler, and she's leading the carbon market work at Perspectives. So she's following the Article 6 negotiations closely over the years, and she's currently running several projects aimed at enhancing the readiness for Article 6 and also contributing towards setting up the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, Article 6.4, which we'll hear much more about today. And finally, we have Cynthia Vega, who's a junior expert at Perspectives and who is working on operationalization of Article 6 at the national level, capacity building, and designing Article 6 activities. So we are in very knowledgeable and capable hands. And just before I hand over, some housekeeping. We have a lot of people joining us today, and for that reason, we will just see our presenters today. So we'll ask people not to raise their hand, but at the same time, one of the benefits of this masterclass series is that we have access to leading experts. So we would really encourage you to submit as many questions as you would like as we're going along. You can do that via the Q&A function. And there are regular breaks in the agenda to collect some of these questions and answer them. So please do take advantage of that. And we look forward to seeing them. But with no further ado, I will hand over to the team, and we are very much looking forward to the presentation.
Thank you very much, David, for the kind introduction. And hello, everybody. My name is Hanna-Mari Ahonen, calling from Finland. Apologies for the voice. Got a bit of a struggle with my voice, but I'm trying to keep it up. So we're going to be talking about project development under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement today. And on the next slide, I think there's a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be doing. So first, we have three parts here today. So one is the introduction and overview to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Then we're going to be diving, and then we have a Q&A at the end of that part. And then we have another part that really dives deeper into the key requirements, not all of the requirements, but key requirements under Article 6 for project development. And then we'll have another Q&A there. And then the third part, we'll look at the actual process, the different steps and the different options for navigating Article 6. There's several options that you would need to choose from as a project developer under Article 6. And we then have a Q&A at that point as well. So the main objective is really to look at all the options that we have for developing projects under Article 6.2 and 6.4, and we'll explain the difference and similarities of those two. So you'll learn why and how Article 6 can be used for project development, the similarities and the differences between 6.2 and 6.4. What are the key actors? What are their roles in project development? What are the key steps? What are the key criteria in project development? And then, as said, the different options for navigating project development and what kind of implications they have. And there will be polls along the way. So we're really looking forward to your active participation through the polls and also through the Q&A. So let's dive into the first part, introducing Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And you can type your questions in the Q&A as we go along. Okay, so starting with an introduction to Article 6. Next slide, please. So let's start with some practical early mover examples. So Article 6 is already ongoing, although some of the rules were only agreed at the end of last year. Still, there's been lots of activities already, and they've been happening all over the world. So this is a map of countries that have already authorized projects under Article 6.2. We'll talk a little bit more about what that exactly means. But you can see that there's there's 20 host countries. There's 33 activities that have already received an authorization in 7 activity types. And the activity types range from RED+ to renewable energy, e-mobility, agriculture waste, and there's a lot. The most popular type is the cook stoves and water filters, so household energy efficiency. So just a reminder that this is already happening around the world. The first ones are already moving, and various countries are already engaging in this. So it is becoming reality. And in the next slide, we will have a case study that we're going to be running through. It's a hypothetical case study. So imagine there is a challenge of inefficient air conditioner units in the world. And they, first of all, they use high electricity, and that results in greenhouse gases. And then they also have high global warming potential refrigerants like HFCs and HCFCs. When they leak, that is really potent in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So one potential project type under Article 6 could be energy efficient AC units or air conditioning units that use low greenhouse gas global warming potential refrigerants. And then they would reduce emissions in two ways. One, by using less electricity, and then secondly, by using lower global warming potential refrigerants in the first place. And then also for the old units, if they're safely collected and disposed of, you also reduce the amount that those units leak into the atmosphere. And then this kind of cooling or air conditioners could be for households. They could be larger units for companies or institutions like schools or hospitals or supermarkets. And different types of activities that would make the actual project would be things like providing financial incentives that help to pay the extra cost of these higher efficient units, maybe some loan scheme or subsidies. Also, developing infrastructure for collecting the old ones and swapping them for the new ones and disposing safely of the old ones. And also training elements so that this project can actually work in practice. So this is the type of case study that we're going to be using throughout the project. And now let's look at some key terms here. And there's also a picture that will follow us throughout the presentation. So in the background, there is always a project or a program, and they reduce emissions or enhance removals of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So we jointly call these emission reductions and removals, call them mitigation outcomes. And they're coming from, in our case, when we're focusing on carbon credits, they come from mitigation activities. So projects or programs that reduce emissions. And if we want these emission reductions or removals to be generated into carbon credits, we need to go through a carbon crediting program. There are several different programs around the world. They assess the mitigation activities, the projects and the programs, and also the emission reductions and removals that they generate. And if they meet certain criteria for carbon credits, then they can be issued as carbon credits by the carbon crediting programs. And the role of these programs is to ensure environmental and social integrity of the emission reductions and the activities that generate them. And these carbon credits are then sold and bought in the carbon markets. And when they're sold, then the money flows back into the project that generated these mitigation outcomes in the first place. And the carbon markets, we have two types of carbon markets, if you wish. Voluntary carbon markets, or we talk about voluntary and compliance markets. Now, we also have emissions trading systems that generate units called emission allowances. And the carbon market is a mix of carbon credits and emission allowances in the same markets. Whenever carbon credits or allowances are used voluntarily, we talk about the voluntary market. Whenever these are used for compliance purposes, for an emissions trading scheme or meeting an obligatory target, we talk about compliance markets. Today, we'll focus only on carbon credits, but we have this emissions trading scheme here in the picture, just to remind that the carbon markets are more than just carbon credits. And so here is an overview of the different terms that we'll be using today. So hopefully this helps to clarify how carbon credits are generated. We'll go into much more detail later, and what's the difference between the voluntary and the compliance markets. And now I think it's time to hand over to Cynthia.
Great. Well, now let us start slowly diving into Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So The Paris Agreement extends climate targets to all countries, and these targets receive the name of Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs in short. Article 6 provides options for countries to cooperate in the implementation of these NDCs, and this cooperation should allow for higher ambition and adaptation actions, and also promote sustainable development and environmental integrity. This has three main components that allows for cooperation. So first, we have Article 6.2, and Article 6.2 sets a framework for cooperative approaches involving the use of internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. Participating countries are also responsible of ensuring environmental integrity and applying accounting in the transfer. Under Article 6.4, which is the second component of Article 6, we have the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, and this is an international crediting program that is established by 6.4, which main overall objective is to promote mitigation and foster sustainable development in the host countries. The PACAM, as we will refer to it throughout the masterclass, is supervised and operates supervisory body. The component of Article 6 cooperation is Article 6.8, which allows and promotes cooperation through non-market-based approaches. So, for example, through technology transfer, direct financial support, among others. This type of cooperation does not generate or carbon credits, so outside of the scope of this masterclass, and we will only be focusing then on 6.2 and 6.4 for the rest of our 2 hours and a half that we have left. Now, Article 6.2. As I said before, Article 6.2 sets a framework for this voluntary cooperation involving ITMOs. This cooperation can happen between countries and entities and must be in line with international Article 6.2. The international guidelines requirements for host countries, and these requirements entail authorization, tracking, accounting, and reporting of the ITMO transactions. ITMOs are real, additional, and verified mitigation outcomes that were achieved after 2021. And as Hanna mentioned before, mitigation outcomes is an umbrella term for jointly to emission reductions. In the Baku decision in COP29, it was further clarified that mitigation outcomes become ITMOs if and only when they are authorized and first transferred. So, authorization and first transfer is a key step. Sorry, do we have...
Sorry, just a little interruption, Cynthia. Maybe you could turn off your video just in case, because your audio is a little bit less than optimal. So let's see if that would help to keep the audio flowing if you turn your video off. Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Let's try that.
Can you hear me now?
I can also see you now. So, okay, let's try it again. Go for it.
Okay, great. So, can you hear? Yeah,
sounds
I guess
good
my
for
audio
now.
is working fine now. Excellent, great.
Yes, sounds
so
good.
Sorry about that. Some IT issues there. Great. So I don't know where you exactly stopped listening to me, but let's go back a little bit. So Article 6.2 sets this framework for the voluntary cooperation and basically sets requirements for authorization, accounting, and reporting of ITMO transactions. ITMOs must be real, additional, and verified mitigation outcomes. And as Hanna explained before, mitigation outcomes is the umbrella term for emission reductions or removals. So we jointly refer to them as mitigation outcomes. Then an ITMO, and this happened in Baku at COP29, it was further clarified that a mitigation becomes an ITMO if and only when a mitigation outcome is authorized and first transferred by the host country. So authorization and first transfer are key processes under Article 6.2. Authorization covers three things. There's an authorization of ITMOs, an authorization of cooperative approaches, and of entities. Through the authorization of mitigation outcomes, a host country indicates that it won't count that mitigation towards its NDC. So an ITMO that is authorized can be then used for three different purposes. An ITMO can be used towards national determined contributions of another country different from the host country. It can be used towards international mitigation purposes and towards other purposes. These last two are jointly referred as other international mitigation purposes. Then, once the ITMO has received an authorization, we can talk about first transfer. And first transfer can mean, again, different things. It primarily depends on the use of the ITMO. So, if an ITMO is authorized to be used towards NDCs, then the first transfer means the first international transfer. And if the ITMO is authorized to be used for OIMP, the host country needs to decide what the meaning of the first transfer is. That means it can be authorization, issuance, use, or voluntary cancellation. Now, if we jump to the requirements for participating countries, every country that wants to participate and cooperate under Article 6.2 need to fulfill certain requirements. For example, the main overarching requirements that they need to fulfill is participating countries are responsible of ensuring environmental integrity and transparency, applying robust accounting, including to avoid double counting, and promote sustainable development. The way countries are meant to accomplish this are then operationalized by another set of criteria, which is, for example, be a party to the Paris Agreement, have an NDC that is updated and having the latest reporting in place, national arrangements for authorizing and tracking the ITMOs, have access to a registry for tracking ITMOs, and this can be either the international registry or a national registry, and report on ITMOs through initial reports, annual and regular information. So basically, countries that want to participate under Article 6.2 need to have these national arrangements for authorization, tracking, and reporting of ITMOs. And now I will pass over to Hanna.
Thank you, Cynthia. We're looking at some key elements for Article 6.2, and there's different levels at which this internationally transferred mitigation outcomes operate. So there's, at the Paris Agreement's level, there are general requirements that Cynthia just mentioned, international guidance on how this has to be done. Then there's going to be there are international reviews at the international level that check whether this guidance is followed. And there is an international registry that countries can use in case they don't have a national registry. But the main operationalization of Article 6 happens at the national level. So the details on how these international guidance are implemented is in national arrangements, national laws, national frameworks. And each country has their own national arrangements. And then the countries will do their own assessment on what they're going to authorize as ITMOs. So that's going to be the assessment. And then they report about how they do this to the UN or the Paris Agreement. And then these reports are then reviewed internationally. And typically you can have a national registry, but if you don't want a national registry, you can also use the international registry. There's also other levels that are optional for Article 6.2. So national arrangements are always required. Typically countries that partner with other countries had bilateral arrangements as well, where the two countries agree on how they together cooperate. And it includes the cooperation agreements and frameworks include their common cooperation provisions. And in those cases, often also the partner country, the buyer country, will assess what they're buying, as well as the host country, what they're authorizing. And then sometimes countries might want to use carbon crediting programs like Gold Standard as one of the tools to show that these requirements are met. And in those cases, it could be that then you also have to meet the requirements of that program and then go through the assessment of that program. And then the carbon credits would be issued in the registry of that program. So there's several levels in Article 6.2. But the important one is the national level. It needs to meet international requirements. And then it can make use of bilateral and programs or partnerships and existing carbon crediting programs. So multi-layer is the main point of this slide. And then on authorization. So in Baku, just at the end of last year, there was a clarification of all the different things that an authorization needs to contain. Not going to go through all of them, but highlighting a few things. So first of all, you need to say, what do you mean by first transfer, since it can mean different things. Also, what are you authorizing the ITMOs for? And then where are they going to be tracked, in which registry this is going to be used, and different types of information on the ITMOs themselves, activity types and such, if they're relevant. And importantly, if you actually change your authorization or even cancel it at a later point, you need to explain what are the circumstances under which you would actually revoke or change the authorization afterwards, because that is a risk. And it's important that you don't undo the authorization, because that could lead to double counting. And there could be some conditions on what conditions have to be met for the authorization to be valid. So lots of different things that authorizations can contain. And then to avoid double counting, a very important point is that countries, when they authorize ITMOs and then first transfer them, they commit themselves, first of all, to check that they have high environmental and social integrity, but also to avoid double counting. And this means that if a country has authorized, host country has authorized and first transferred ITMOs, or mitigation outcomes, they must do a corresponding adjustment. And that means the country that transfers it, the host country that transfers these ITMOs, does not count it towards its own NDC, their own national target. And that is done by adjusting its emissions balance. So we have a little animation here on how that is done. So a host country has an NDC, and then let's say in this case, before this project, it was going to meet its NDC anyway. But after this project, it reduces its emissions much more than what it needs for its NDC. So it can afford to sell that amount that was achieved by this project, authorize it as ITMOs, and transfer it. And it can transfer it for, can you click a little bit backwards still, please? So you can transfer it for other international mitigation purposes, or you can transfer it towards NDCs. And depending on what use it is, the first transfer could happen at different points. But the first transfer triggers the host country to adjust its emissions balance. So it will not just look at the emissions happening there, but it will have to adjust to what it has transferred, so that then anything it transfers away, it needs to adjust in its emissions balance. And as you can see here, the adjusted emissions balance, the light blue one, still allows the country to meet its NDC, although it has adjusted for the fact that it has transferred some of those mitigation outcomes away. Now, if these mitigation outcomes are transferred towards the use of another NDC, then the using country will also do a corresponding adjustment. Let's say we have a country, acquiring country, that has an NDC. It's not going to meet it with its own emissions being higher than the NDC. And it buys some ITMOs and adjusts its emissions balance by the amount of ITMOs it's bought. And that will allow it to meet its NDC. And this also means that these are only counted towards one NDC and not the other. And that avoids double counting. So that's An important thing about ICMO is it represents mitigation that the host country will not count to its target, and that means they're available for others to count towards their, the buyer of the ICMO can count uniquely the mitigation outcomes. Next slide, please.
Great, thank you, Hanna. Now I will take over again, and let's talk about Article 6.4, the Paris Agreement creating mechanism, and Article 6.4 emission reduction credits. So the PACAM is an international carbon crediting program that aims to promote mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions and sustainable development in the host country. The mechanism ensures that the activities that are implemented under the mechanism delivers overall mitigation in global emissions, and that also supports adaptation actions. And this is ensured by projects that are developed under the PACAM must need to surrender a percentage of the carbon credits that are issued for these purposes. And we have to remember that the PACAM is or works as in principle as any other carbon creating program. So what the PACAM does is register projects and issue carbon credits. And these carbon credits are called Article 6.4 emission reductions. These carbon credits or Article 6.4 emission reductions represent emission reductions or removals and can, but do not necessarily have to be authorized as ITMOs. If an Article 6.4 ER is not authorized as ITMO, then it receives the name of Mitigation Contribution Units or MCUs. The PACAM has main actors in its operation. So, first of all, the PACAM operates under international oversight. It's supported by a formal governance structure, and it's regulated, and its regulatory body is called the supervisory body. The supervisory body approves requirements, so for example, standards, methodologies, tools, etc., registers activities, and issues carbon credits, the Article 6.4 emission reduction units. The supervisory body is at the same time overseen by the Paris Agreement's decision-making body, which is the CMA, which provides this guidance and oversight, and the SB reports annually to the CMA. Both the CMA and the SB are supported by the UNFCCC Secretariat, and in its endeavors of approving requirements and standards, the SB is further supported by the methodology expert panel. The supervisory body also accredits designated operational entities, or DOEs in short, and these are basically third-party independent auditors, which take or are in charge of validating the activities and verifying the mitigation outcomes. Host countries have a big role in the PACAM as well. They must identify eligible activities to be developed under the PACAM and may also establish national requirements for these activities. So, for example, defining which methodologies can be used in the country. Host countries must also approve activities that seek registration under the PACAM and authorize project participants. Then, of course, these project participants are in charge of implementing and developing projects, and they are responsible of requesting registration of the activity, requesting issuance of the mitigation outcomes, issuance of the Article 6.4 emission reduction units, and in the process of validation and verification, they are in charge of contracting or hiring the DOEs that will take over these responsibilities. Is that the PACAM is now operational. In 2024, the transition period of the CDM activities to the PACAM was closed, and we also had approval of key standards and procedures such as the methodologies and removal standards. So now in 2025, the SB is working on approving further standards. And for example, at the last SB meeting, the additionality standard was approved. And for the rest of the year, it's going to be working on approving the first methodologies, registering the first new activities, and issuing the first Article 6.4 ERs. So once the first PACA methodologies are approved, new activities can then apply them and request registration under the PACA. Now, jumping into the comparison of Article 6.2 and 6.4. Because they are under the umbrella of Article 6, they have common aims and requirements. They both have to promote mitigation and sustainable development, and they both have to comply with requirements for environmental and social integrity. The difference lies in Article 6.2 is a framework. So it covers the authorization, tracking, recording, reporting, and accounting of IDMO transactions. Whereas the PACAM, it's actually a carbon crediting program. So its main responsibilities or main activities is to register activities and issue Article 6.4 ERs. Then Article 6.2, under Article 6.2, there are rules that provide guidance for countries to operationalize these requirements, but it's mainly countries who ensure environmental integrity through the national criteria. And these countries are in charge or are responsible of aligning with international guidance. In the PACAM, the supervisory body is the one who ensures environmental integrity through the international criteria and procedures that it sets. So if we put it like this, Article 6.2 leaves details to participating countries, so they are in charge of setting their own national criteria, whereas in Article 6.4, the PACAM provides detailed international requirements for project developers to develop activities, to seek registration, to seek issuance of credits, etc. Also, under Article 6.2, host countries can engage unilaterally or bilaterally, multilaterally with other countries. And under the PACAM, the host country can engage with the activities only through the national approval. In both, mitigation outcomes can be authorized as IDMOs. So if an Article 6.4 emission reduction receives authorization, it would automatically need to follow the rules of Article 6.2. And if it doesn't receive an authorization, then it can be used nationally. But this is the core part. Both can be authorized. Both mitigation outcomes or credits can be authorized that are happening under 6.2 and PACAM. And over to you, Hannah.
Okay, thanks. So here we see the picture again that we were looking at earlier with the key terms. And now let's see where Article 6.4 and 6.2 actually fit into this picture. So if you want to turn mitigation outcomes into carbon crediting programs, as a carbon credits, you need to use a carbon crediting program. And one of the carbon crediting programs is Article 6.2's, 4 is PACAM. So if you click once, you can see where the PACAM comes in. So PACAM is a carbon crediting program. It's a supply side thing that provides carbon credits that are called A6.4 ERs. And then Article 6.2 is a way for mitigation outcomes not to be counted by the host country, given up by the host country for uses that need a unique use. So they are whatever mitigation outcomes are authorized and first transferred by the host country, simply put. And that means that they can be used for specific purposes. And we'll look at the purposes in a moment. And you can have a credit that is both issued by the PACM and authorized under Article 6.2 as an ITMO, or then you can have an ITMO that is not under the PACM, or you can have a carbon credit under the PACM that's not authorized as an ITMO. So let's see how that works. Now we'll get into the same picture, but get a little bit more layers here. So we have still the projects and programs and mitigation outcomes. So we reduce emissions, remove carbon from the atmosphere. Then we'll go to a carbon crediting program. If you click once, I think it will show up. And one of those carbon crediting programs is PACM. You can use that, or you can use something else. And if you issue a carbon credit under PACM, it's called an A6.4ER. Let's call everything else just carbon credits. They also have different names. So it could be another carbon crediting program, or you can use a PACM. Now you've generated carbon credits. And then the next step is, if you want to, you can then authorize those as ITMOs. You can also directly authorize mitigation outcomes at ITMOs without going through a carbon crediting program. You can go through a carbon crediting program like Gold Standard. You can go through a carbon crediting program, the PACM. Any of those mitigation outcomes can be authorized as ITMOs. And so then you can have different types of mitigation outcomes, carbon credits, A6.4 ERs, that have the host country authorization, and eventually they'll be first transferred by the host country to truly become ITMOs. Or you cannot, it's voluntary, you don't have to authorize mitigation outcomes at ITMOs. So in the carbon market, you'll also have carbon credits in the market that are not authorized at ITMOs. You'll have Article 6.4 ERs that are not authorized at ITMOs. They're called MCUs. I'm sorry about all the abbreviations. It's just how it is. Then you can have Article 6.4 ERs authorized at ITMOs, other carbon credits authorized at ITMOs, or mitigation outcomes authorized at ITMOs. They're all ITMOs. Now, why does this matter? So these can be used in somewhat different ways. ITMOs represent mitigation outcomes that are not counted by the host country, and that means they can be used for particular purposes. Can you press one more time so I can show how they're used? So ITMOs are not counted by the host country. That means they can be counted by other countries, for other countries' NDCs. They can also be counted for international aviation, and they can be voluntarily used as well. Now, carbon credits, or MCUs, that are not authorized at ITMOs, they might count towards a host country. And then they can be used for compliance, domestic compliance purposes. They can be used for climate finance, and they can also be used for voluntary contributions. So depending on whether you have an ITMO or not, it influences what you can use it for and who might be interested in buying it. So that's an important thing to understand. And then in the next slide, we actually see some potential buyers of different types. So those mitigation outcomes that are authorized at ITMOs, you can use them towards NDCs. At the moment, we have countries like Japan, Switzerland, Singapore, South Korea, and Norway who are buying ITMOs towards their NDCs. So they're in the market at the moment. They have different purchasing programs. They're looking for ITMOs for NDC purposes. Then for international aviation, we have a scheme called the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, or CORSIA, which is now on a voluntary first phase. And their international airlines can buy ITMOs, or mitigation outcomes that are authorized, to meet their obligations under this CORSIA. And then there's Sweden, who actually is not using ITMOs towards its NDC, but towards a national target. And they're also buying ITMOs. You can also have some voluntary buyers for ITMOs for voluntary offsetting or even voluntary contributions. And now, what about all the mitigation outcomes that are not authorized at ITMOs? Well, you can deliver results-based climate finance with it voluntarily, or even public organizations could buy credits and use them to deliver results-based finance. And host countries as well could use them as a domestic price-based mechanism. Domestic carbon credits could be used in a domestic carbon tax. We even have examples of that in places like South Africa, Colombia, and elsewhere, where you can use these carbon credits to comply with a domestic carbon tax, for example. So there are different use cases, and depending on what use and who you want to sell your credits to, you might want to have it authorized as an ITMO, or you might not need to. Next slide, please. So now it's time to hand over to Cynthia again.
Yes, great. Thank you, Hannah. So we will have our first poll of this long session, and the instructions are exactly the same as David. So please scan the QR code with your smartphone, then you will be directed to our questions. And the first question, we have two sets, or we have a set of two questions, and it's regarding how to use Article 6. So I will stop sharing my screen, and then we will jump into your seeing the results. I can see that we're already getting some results here, so let's see. The first question that we have today is, what do you think are the largest demand sources for ITMOS? And all you have to do is drag and replace the options, and at the top should be the largest one. So we have used by governments toward their NDCs, used by international airlines for CORSIA compliance, or used by companies and other non-state entities for voluntary purposes. Great, so we can see that at least we have in the first place that our audience thinks that the largest demand of sources for ITMOS is used by governments towards their NDC, but actually CORSIA is not far behind. Excellent. And of course, we can see that it's clear that used by companies and other non-state entities is the less popular from all of the answers. Now, if we jump to the second question, what do we have here? So for the second question is, what do you think are the largest demand sources for mitigation contribution units? So for the Article 6.4 ERs that are not authorized, we have the same options. We have used by companies and other non-state entities to voluntarily deliver results-based climate finance, used by host country governments for a domestic policy scheme. So for example, domestic emission trading systems or carbon tax, or used by non-host country government to deliver public results-based climate finance. And here the most popular answer was used by companies and other non-state entities to voluntarily deliver results-based climate finance. Interesting, but actually the two latter ones are not too far behind. So we have a lot of respondents that also think that MCUs could be used and largely demanded by host countries for domestic policy schemes. Great. And I think that with this, and looking at the time, we should jump into looking at your questions and solving some of your answers. So I will hand over to Juliana.
Thank you, Cynthia, and also thank you for engaging very actively in the Q&A channel. I see a lot of interesting questions, and I already need to apologize that we cannot answer all right now, but I realized that we will answer some of these questions later on when presenting further. So please, if your question is not answered now, it might happen later. And I also invite my colleagues Hannah and Cynthia to add to my answers. So I take some questions. Let's start with the first one I picked here. So somebody asked, if a country decides not to authorize a project under Article 6 in order to keep it for its own NDC, does it need to pay the developer for these reductions? Otherwise, there will be no incentive for developers to place projects in such countries, right? So yeah, generally the answer is that it's really the host country's national prerogative to provide an authorization and to also potentially undertake changes to a given authorization. And this is obviously an investment risk. It contributes to investment uncertainty, and we will come back to such risks and potential mitigation options on later slides. But what I can already mention, for example, at COP29, and Cynthia touched upon it, like one decision was also if changes are made to authorizations, like if this is possible, you need to actually agree on terms and conditions for such changes. So a few safeguards have been introduced basically. So it's up to the host country and buyers to negotiate on these terms and conditions when changes can be undertaken. So yeah, one can also influence it to a certain extent, and obviously the host country also has an interest, to attract investors and buyers. So also the host country will not act maliciously here, but also think about its interest and knows about the investment uncertainty and security risks here from the investor side. I quickly pause in case Hanna wants to add something. If not, I move on with the next question.
Yeah, I wonder about this question, thanks, depending on how you understand it, because one thing is that if they've actually authorized and then they decide not to afterwards. And there was also a question on whether, can the host country sell ITMOs if it doesn't meet its NDC? Well, ideally not. There isn't exactly anything preventing it. A responsible country shouldn't sell things that it needs for its NDC. And there's also a reason why no host country is forced to authorize anything. Because their first and foremost responsibility is to meet their NDC, and they shouldn't be selling things that they need for their NDC. At the same time, certain activities will not happen without the incentives from carbon credits. So then they would just project developers that don't get an authorization and need it to implement their projects just wouldn't implement it. So you can't force the host country to do that. You can't force the host country to authorize anything. But it is true that then some things will not happen in that country. And no, the host country will not pay any compensation for the project developer for refusing to authorize, because it's voluntary to authorize. So that's sort of another aspect on this. What if the country says no? The country has the right to say no. The country has the responsibility to meet its NDC and implement policies that help to meet its NDC, first and foremost. And this cooperation is voluntary for our countries. So then you can't force a country to authorize your project. And back to you, Julie.
Yeah, thanks, Hanna, for adding. Another question was, are Article 6 project always bilateral? And if so, do both countries own the project? So the quick answer is no. When we talk specifically about Article 6.2 cooperative approaches, it can be a cooperation also between a country and a buyer entity like a company. So a host party engaging with a company. It can be multiple countries cooperating with multiple private entities. So basically, there is a lot of freedom in how you want to design that cooperation, as long as you align with the minimum requirements that are given in the Article 6.2 guidance. Then there was a question that Hanna also, I think, answered to a certain extent already, regarding South Africa, and what if countries have national carbon pricing schemes established. And here the question is, South Africa has got a CO2 tax. Besides, there is a market within the country also. That implies that transfer of carbon credits may be done within the host country. Is this correct? And Hanna hinted at this when we were talking about the quality of non-authorized credits and what role they can also play, towards the use of these national schemes. And yes, in some countries like South Korea, etc., for example, there's also the use of international carbon credits allowed, not towards for compliance. So I hope this answers this question, and Hanna, please add to it.
I don't have additions to that, but I would want to pick up one question here that comes up quite a few times, and it's basically what's the role of other carbon crediting programs and the relationship to PACM? Well, PACM is like the CDM. Even in the past, the CDM coexisted with other carbon crediting programs. You could buy credits from CDM or you could buy credits from the gold standard, especially in the voluntary carbon market, but not solely, because like credits from gold standard are recognized even for domestic compliance in South Africa, as it happens. So we now with PACM have the Paris Agreement has offered one carbon crediting program more. So it doesn't force gold standard, for example, to send methodologies to PACM. It doesn't really make sense. Gold standard is providing the same service as the PACM, so you can choose between PACM and gold standard, just like before you could choose between gold standard and CDM and others. So they will continue to be options. In the perfect world, you'd probably have one perfect carbon crediting program and you wouldn't need to have other carbon crediting programs. But we're not in a perfect world. And first of all, the PACM is barely operational. So the reason for the other carbon crediting programs is they've been operating the whole time. So that's a very big benefit of these carbon crediting programs. So I would say that these will coexist. And then especially with 6.2, and the question was, what's the point in PACM if you can use 6.2? They're doing slightly different things. PACM is one of many carbon crediting programs that issues carbon credits. The point of PACM is that it's an international mechanism. We're hoping it's the best. We don't know if it's going to be the best, but we're hoping it's trying to be the new good best practice. So maybe it is more trusted. That remains to be seen. Now, Article 6.2 is another thing. It's about the host country saying, I won't count these towards my target, so the buyer can use them for unique purposes. And you can combine these two. So the Article 6.2 could require you to use PACM, or it could say you can use PACM or gold standard, but you can't use something else. So there can be combinations depending on the country. So they're not mutually exclusive. They will probably coexist, and the rest of this session will about how to navigate the different options. And depending on what country and what buyer you are, they might have different preferences. So that does make this an interesting landscape, to say the least.
Yeah, thanks, Hanna, for picking an additional question. And looking at the time, perhaps we take a 1-minute briefer before we start with the next session. And we will be back in 1 minute, starting around 2 p.m.
Great. So I think that was a very quick and fast break. And because we're so tight in time and we really want to get through all of the contents of the masterclass, let us start again. So for the second part, we're going to dive deep into the key requirements of Article 6. Great. So both Article 6.2 and the PACM share high-level requirements for mitigation outcomes. So, for example, we have the requirement of the additionality demonstration, permanence, robust baseline setting below business as usual, robust monitoring, environmental and social safeguards, promotion of sustainable development, and avoidance of double counting. Throughout this section 2, or part 2 of the presentation, we're going to be investigating why are these criteria important, what is new under Article 6, and how are they elaborated into detailed requirements, particularly under the PACM, which is where we can find detailed specific requirements on how to operationalize them. Now, comparing the requirements under 6.2 and 6.4, it's clear, and again, we have common requirements under both of the of Article 6.2 and 6.4. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but it's important to note that these are the same in the high level view of the implementation or project development. So, for example, emission reductions and removals need to be, again, real, additional, and verified. Activities cannot or must not lead to a net increase in global emissions within and between the NDC implementation periods. Mitigation needs to be from 2021 onwards, so the carbon credits vintage needs to be older than 2021. Activities or project developers need to set the baselines in a conservative way, and this is a key aspect of developing projects under Article 6, is that the baseline needs to be set below business as usual and taking into account existing policies and addressing uncertainties and leakage. Also, activities need to show that non-permanence risk is minimized and also have some safeguards for reversals. Regarding environmental and social risks and impacts, activities need to show that these risks and impacts are minimized and, where possible, are avoided. And for example, they also need to show how they contribute to the national sustainable development objectives of the country and contribute to adaptation and overall mitigation of global emissions. The requirements that are different are those requirements that entail methodology. So under 6.4, we have further requirements and specific things that activities need to comply with when using the methodologies or for the methodologies. And then we also have requirements specific for Article 6.4 for local and global stakeholder consultations. We also talked about, in the first part of the presentation, about authorization and approval. Authorization, or we exclusively talk about authorization under Article 6.2 for cooperative approaches for entities and for ITMOs. And authorization is a process that host countries are required to set and undertake, and it's optional for other countries. So a host country needs to authorize, and the buyer of those ITMOs, it's optional for them to see whether they also want to authorize the ITMO that they are buying. Then under the PACM, we talk about approval and authorization. Host countries need to approve the activity. And when they approve the activity, they look at information or indication on how the activity fosters sustainable development in the host party. They also look at approving any potential renewal of the crediting period. So the activity may not only have just one crediting period, but several. And also how the activity relates to implementation of the NDC. So these are things that the host country approves when it approves the activity. And then we talk about authorization under the PACM for the authorization of public and private entities and for the provision of authorization statements. So a host country needs to authorize the public or private entities that will participate in the activity and need to authorize, and this is completely optional if the project developer seeks authorization for the carbon credits. It needs to authorize or provide a statement of authorization when Article 6.4 ERs wants to be internationally transferred. The key actors in setting and assessing these criteria are the ones, or let me repick it up there. So we have different levels of criteria. And these criteria and these requirements are assessed by the different actors that are involved in the transaction. So we have different actors under 6.2, and these actors have also different responsibilities under the PACAM. When an activity and a mitigation outcome complies with the requirements, then these actors confirm the compliance through very specific actions. So in the case of a host country, the host country will look at an activity, and then it will assess whether it complies with the national requirements that it set for authorization under 6.2. So if this activity complies with the national requirements of the host country, then it will provide an authorization, and it will first transfer the ITMO when it's due. So that's mandatory. Under the PACAM, the host country will assess how the activity that is seeking registration complies with the criteria that it's set. For instance, if it's under the eligible activity list, and then if it does, it will provide an approval that the activity can seek registration under the PACAM. Then we have a using country, and if you can just click through the slide, because we have an animated slide there. So
we can actually see all of them already are in
great.
our slides.
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
So
excellent.
Can you see them as well?
Yeah, it's coming a little bit slow for me, but now I see them. Great. So also we have the using country, and the using country under Article 6.2 will undertake the same assessment using its own requirements for authorization, for authorizing buying the ITMO. And then, of course, this authorization is optional. This is not required under Article 6.2 guidance. And under the PACAM, it's not applicable because we don't have that country or using country role. Then under 6.2, the third-party entities, which are going to validate activity and verify the mitigation outcomes, will give a positive evaluation. And if they give a positive evaluation, then they will provide the validation reports and verifications necessary to the activity, and they will do the same in the PACAM. Then the supervisory body, under Article 6.2, they don't have any role, but under the PACAM, they have a registration. They register activities and issue mitigation outcomes, or issue, carbon credits called Article 6.4 emission reductions. And lastly, we have the role of the carbon crediting program operators. And as Hanna explained, under 6.2, the carbon crediting programs may have a role if project developers seek authorization of the carbon credits issued under this carbon crediting program. So the carbon crediting programs will assess the compliance of the activity with their own requirements, and then we provide this registration and issuance. And under the PACAM, they don't have any role because the PACAM is its own international crediting program. So for the next slide, we have the requirements for the PACAM and how it comes together as a hierarchy. So as explained before, the Paris Agreement and the CMA decisions are overruling or providing the guidance for the SV. Then at the SV level, we have standards and procedures documents. And the standards represent the mandatory level of attainment of attainment or a specification. So for example, we have the standards for activities, validation, verification, etc. And then at the same level, we have the procedures. The procedures tells us the mandatory steps that we have to take to comply with the CMA decisions or the supervisory body standards. So for example, we have an activity cycle of the PACAM, which walks or provide guidance for the project developers in how to seek registration and seek or require issuance of carbon credits. And we also have procedures for the DOEs when validating and verifying, etc. Then at the third level, we have tools. And these tools are just means for demonstrating specific requirements. And at the last level or bottom level, we have guidelines and the supplementary documents. I think now I pass over to you, Hanna.
Thank you, Cynthia. Yes, and I see a few questions in the chat were already hinting towards the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism requirements. And here on the slide, you basically see an overview of these requirements. And I need to mention right away, these are high level here, yeah? And they basically come from the Glasgow decision, the 6.4 decision from Glasgow. And yeah, in that one, all these requirements are laid out. And then Cynthia showed this hierarchy. And basically what the supervisory body is currently doing is like it is breaking down these high level requirements into what this means in practice. And this is currently ongoing. So I will, on the next slides, go a little bit into how this has so far been operationalized, and also mention where, you know, we need to wait for further work. So web activity developers also need to be a little bit patient and wait for the next standard on tool to be adopted by the supervisory body. So on the slide, as said, an overview of all the 6.4 requirements, and some of them are not new if you compare them to, you know, existing requirements in the voluntary carbon market or, you know, the old CDM requirements. What's new is, for example, encouraging ambition over time. There has been a lot of discussion of how this can be operationalized. Then being real, transparent, conservative, credible, establishing that the selected baseline is below business as usual. And I will dive into this a little bit further on the next slides, what this means exactly. Then contributing to equitable sharing of mitigation benefits between participating parties. If you ask yourself now how, I will come back to this later on as well. For example, one proposal is to shorten the overall length of the crediting period, to make it basically shorter than, you know, the lifetime of the technology here as one option to contribute to equitable sharing. Then aligning with the NDC, so the host country's NDC, but also with the overall goals of the Paris Agreement. There are concrete baseline setting approaches that are specified in the 6.4 decision as requirement, and I will come back to those as well. Methodologies need to encourage broad participation, include data sources and accounting for uncertainty and monitoring requirements. There is also recognition for suppressed demand possible, same as in the clean development mechanism, basically. And then what also needs to be taken into account are policies and measures and relevant circumstances. There is this option to develop standardized baselines. So either the host country can make a proposal to the supervisory body and the supervisory body approves it, or the host country asks the supervisory body, please develop a standardized baseline for this activity type. Then we have additionality requirements. We will also dive a bit more into those on the next slides. And yeah, non-permanence needs to be minimized and reversals need to be addressed in full, and also leakage needs to be avoided. So these are the overarching requirements. And on the next slide, we will jump into the second call, basically. And may I ask you to scan this QR code? And it would be really interesting to see what you, the audience, think about the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. So please scan the QR code. I'm starting to read out the first questions. So what is your view on the following 4 statements? And you basically need to say from 5, I fully agree, to 1, fully disagree. So the PACM and other carbon crediting programs will coexist and have diverging requirements. Other carbon crediting programs, meaning, for example, Gold Standard, Vera. Then the PACM and other carbon crediting programs will coexist and have increasingly aligned requirements. Third, countries will have national requirements that diverge from the PACM's requirements in the 6.2 context. And then countries will have national requirements that are increasingly aligned with the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. So I'm seeing people are voting. Let's see.
Yeah, these questions take a time, so maybe we'll give it a few minutes. But I'm glad that people are taking the time to do that.
Yes, please. Also, the next question would be, what would be your most important considerations if you buy carbon credits for compliance use? So this is a ranking question. And the last one for this round is, what would be your most important considerations if you buy carbon credits for voluntary use? So let's give it a bit, and then we go through the answers. One more minute. Okay, so great. Let's jump into the results. And Beatrice, if you can go back to the previous question. Yes, so I think if you click further, we see what people think about the statements. So PACM and other, yes, exactly. So the PACM and other carbon crediting programs will coexist and have increasingly aligned requirements. So here the result is that in general, this audience seems to partly agree with the statement. Jumping to the next statement, the PACM and other carbon crediting programs will coexist and have increasingly aligned requirements. So, yeah, and also here, people seem to agree that there will be, increasingly aligned requirements. And jumping to the next question, countries will have national requirements that diverge from the PACM's requirements. So here people are in between neutral and partly disagree. And the next one, countries will have national requirements that are increasingly aligned with the PACM. So yeah, so people think in this audience that national governments will also seek an alignment with the PACM requirements. This is interesting. Okay, so next question, what would be your most important consideration if you buy carbon credits for compliance use? So let's see, the highest ranked option, carbon credits meet the requirements for the compliance use. And then actually second one, meet the requirements under the PACM. So this is really interesting that here there seems to be an interest also to really align with these PACM requirements. Okay, jumping to the next question, what would be your most important consideration if you buy carbon credits for voluntary use? And here, the option that ranked highest is carbon credits meet the requirements of a carbon crediting program and are perceived as high quality by the general public. So here, public perception also plays a key role next to meeting the requirements of a carbon crediting program. Thank you all for this, really interesting. Let's continue with the content and let's see what you think about the PACM requirements going in more depth. Coming to the key requirements for additionality, and here I need to mention that there exist, so at COP29, that was mentioned before, the basically parties, agreed to the standards that were adopted by the supervisory body already prior to COP29, and that's the standard on methodologies and the standard on removals. And the standard on methodologies also lays out the same requirements that I have mentioned on the previous slide, goes a little more in detail, but not really deep. And then there are further standards that are currently developed and tools that then go more into depth. And additionality is one of these standards that is already out there. So this is why we will dive a bit more in detail on the next slides. And in general, what can we say to this date about additionality demonstration now across all carbon crediting programs? The CDM tools, 001 and also the combined one, are really widely used across different carbon crediting programs. And at the same time, also these tools were criticized for letting non-additional activities pass that test. So now in the Paris area, we have new considerations. All countries have these indices, we talked about them, and they need to be considered. Same as for the national policies that might, basically come from the NDC as well, from that target. And this is also why many programs, carbon crediting programs, are currently revising their additionality requirements. And now, what's the difference between 6.2 and 6.4? We talked about this before. Under 6.2, you have the national criteria. You could have like a positive or white list. Parties call this, countries use different terms here. But you know that these lists usually specify eligible activities, or also say like these activities are actually automatically additional. So you don't need to do further testing, etc. And and basically under 6.2, what we're seeing a lot is this dependence on like existing approaches. From, as you said before, you can use gold standard, you can use a Vera methodology, etc. under 6.2. So you use that approach that is enshrined in that specific methodology. Now, under the PACM, you have these detailed requirements. And as said before, there's the standard on methodologies document that was adopted in October last year. And now in February of this year, the supervisory body has adopted the standard on additionality. And that really goes into more depth in terms of what is required as compared to that standard on methodology. So going to the next slide, what you can see here. Yeah, thank you. So one of the key requirements is that the activity developer needs to show that the activity would not have occurred in the absence of the incentives from the mechanism, and demonstrate that it exceeds any mitigation that is required by law or regulation. And compared to the CDM, like the emphasis is really here on the incentives, and hints already towards financial testing, to which I come also in more detail. And what does the standard basically say? That standard on additionality that was adopted by the supervisory body in February of this year. It foresees the following approaches to additionality. So regulatory additionality, demonstrate that the proposed activity presents mitigation that exceeds what is required by law or regulation. Then an analysis of lock-in risk. So demonstrate that the implementation of the activity does not lead to locking in emissions levels or carbon-intensive technologies or practices. So here really the alignment with the Paris Agreement's long-term goal. Then the investment analysis, and I come back to this, but it's basically a default approach, the investment analysis. And you need to demonstrate that, the activity is not financially viable without the revenue that you get for the Article 6.4 emission reductions. Then there is a barrier analysis where you would need to demonstrate that the activity would be prevented by barriers, and that the incentives from the mechanism are actually, helping to overcome those barriers. A common practice analysis linked to the penetration rate of the technology. And then there are also performance-based approaches allowed. And coming to the next slide, we have certain combinations that are also allowed of these different tests that I have outlined. First of all, like each methodology needs to have a prior consideration notification, needs to include a regulatory analysis and the analysis of lock-in risk. So that's a given. And then when it comes to financial additionality tests, as I mentioned before, the default is basically an investment analysis. And if you decide not to go for an investment analysis because this is not feasible, one actually needs to provide a justification. And also, if you either go for an investment analysis or a barrier analysis, you need to complement it with a common practice analysis. So this is also a must. So it's similar to what we see in the VCM practice and what we saw in the CDM. But what this hints towards already is that there's going to be less of a choice. So a little bit of less window shopping, so to say, with different approaches, but more in terms of go for, you need to either go for, or you need to go for the investment analysis as a default. And if you really think it's unfeasible, then provide a justification why. As mentioned, an entirely alternative approach would be to go for performance-based approaches, but these are subject to applicability conditions. And that applicability condition, for example, says that this can only be applied where it can be proven with 90% probability that the activities exceed an emissions performance benchmark. So you need to watch out that you really meet those applicability conditions. And if you follow the flow that is shown here on the slide, and if all these tests are successfully done, then the activity would be considered additional. So diving even a little bit deeper into the specific requirements for these tests on the next slide. So for the investment analysis, there are 3 different tests analysis that are specified that you can use: a simple cost analysis, a benchmark analysis, and an investment comparison analysis. So also similar to what the tests that have been previously been used. And as I mentioned already before, if you decide to go for a barrier analysis, you need to justify this. And you really need to provide also a proper analysis of these barriers and provide all the justifications basically. On the next slide, there are even some further requirements specified here and there. And what I need to mention about barrier analysis as an alternative that I haven't mentioned so far, it's also only allowed to do so in specific cases. So when it is a household level activity, or it's undertaken by a small entity without access to third-party finance. It's at this stage not yet, really defined how small entity, etc., is defined. But these are basically the requirements. It was basically the standard really restricts this use of the barrier analysis. And with the common practice analysis, you need to define indicators that assess common practice based on technology used in relation to realistic maximum market size or potential. And also choose an appropriate geographical boundary and justify this. And here I hand over to Hanna. We will go a little bit more into practicalities again and coming back to the case study.
Thank you, Yuli. In the interest of time, I will only highlight a couple of things here. So remember these energy efficient air conditioning units. So in that case, to actually demonstrate additionality for these more efficient AC units, you would have to show that these efficient units are not required by law. And also, if you want to count destruction from the old units as emission reductions under this project, you would have to show that you're not required to do that by law. So that's how you do regulatory analysis. And then in terms of financial analysis, there are some benefits from energy efficiency AC units. For example, they save electricity because they don't spend as much electricity. So you have some positive benefits. So you would be using an investment analysis showing that the benefits of using the more energy efficient one are not sufficient to justify the higher cost that they have. And there are more economically attractive options, so cheaper but less efficient AC units available. So a comparison of those. And then in terms of simple cost analysis, when you do things like destroying refrigerants from old units, if it's not required by law, it's just a cost. There's no financial benefit for it. So then you can use a simpler analysis for that. And then you should also be able to show with common practice analysis as a complement that these energy efficient AC units are not a common practice. They are not seen around in your country or the area. And when you're doing these additionality demonstrations, it's really important that you don't just say things, but you actually provide credible evidence of key parameters and proof of what you're saying. Even if you're using interest rates, you have to prove why you're using this interest rate. Why is it relevant for the commercial or the households, for example? So now in the next slide, we will hope that the video works. Our colleague, Mark, will be telling a little bit more about additionality demonstrations, some expert tips. We can't hear the sound, actually.
We apply it,
something we can...
first of all, kind of...
Now it worked.
For a case study, a project that we recently got validated, we finalized validation. We applied, first of all, kind of 4 steps. First of all, we checked would the activity fall under the unconditional part of the NDC. So then it would be not additional. So we proved that it's not part of the unconditional NDC, and that this activity would not be realized because maybe of a law that is in place or that is planned, or a regulation that is. There have been cases where in countries where it's not clear from the NDC whether it's under the unconditional part or the conditional part. Some countries don't define that specifically between unconditional and conditional. In that case, it should be possible to directly engage with the host country to get a confirmation that the planned measure, your mitigation technology, your mitigation measure would not be covered under the unconditional part, or better say, would be covered under the conditional target. Step 1, as I said, regulatory additionality. Then the second step in our case study was a financial analysis, including sensitivity analysis, the additionality. So we conducted actually a barrier analysis on top. So not either or, but both financial analysis and the barrier analysis. And we did this for each of the components. So this project had actually one component in the commercial sector and one component in the residential sector. And we did the whole additionality proof actually for both, one for the commercial sector and one for the residential sector. It is important to include monetarization of barriers, so putting costs to such barriers, what costs would be involved actually to overcome such barriers. Also important for the barrier analysis, justify the assumptions, justify the data, provide references, sources to the data that you are using for it. That's very important for the validation later. That was step 3, barrier analysis. Step 4 was common practice analysis.
All right, Hannah, the video's over. I think you can take over now.
Thank you. I think it's Julie covering the baseline setting, actually.
Yes, thank you. So this was additionality, and now we dive into baseline setting. And what's the new thing? We have talked about this on the previous slide. We have heard it in the videos. It's the below business as usual baseline. And how to set baselines below business as usual. Currently, what we see in practice that it is done by, for example, using an ambitious benchmark or discount factors. And but how you decide to put what discount factor to put, that depends also a little bit. Because under 6.2 there is no, it's really participating parties that decide how and how much below business as usual the baseline must be set. With the PACM, there are requirements and approaches and that you need to follow to set the baseline below business as usual, and we will dive into those on the next slide. So all methodologies of the Paris Agreement mechanism must set baselines below business as usual and calculate the difference between the baseline versus business as usual emissions. And also here is a methodology standard that has been approved last October, the standard on methodologies that provides some high-level principles. And compared to the additionality standard, the baseline standard has not yet been approved by the supervisory body. This is still, a draft version, which is why I'm going to touch up on it, but I'm not going to go a lot into detail because it could still fundamentally change. And what I need to also mention here, this is now project level applicability. So for programs and sectoral and policy crediting, jurisdictional crediting, they will develop a different standard or tool in the future. Going to the next slide. Here you see the steps from the last draft that the methodological expert panel, so that's basically the body that does the technical work and forwards this to the supervisory body. And this is the last draft from beginning of this year that was discussed by the supervisory body. And what it foresees is that the first step would be, select one of the following performance-based approaches. Either a best available technology approach or an ambitious benchmark approach or an existing actual or historical emissions approach that you then need to adjust downwards. And the second step would then be to apply this approach and to identify the baseline scenario and quantify emissions and removals. And the third step is to be really conservative when you do that. And then step 4, and this is the most contentious step right now, is how is this downward adjustment quantified, and whether that's applicable to all of these 3 baseline setting approaches that you see in step 1, or is it only applicable to the third one? So now the tendency is really, okay, it's most likely going to be applicable to all 3 of these concrete baseline setting approaches that you see in step 1. And how exactly that is to be quantified, that's still discussed. But most likely there will be some alignment at the, at the sectoral activity level to make sure that this is in line with the long-term Paris Agreement goal. But as said, this is an ongoing debate, so this is why I don't want to dive into too much detail here. And then in the current draft version as well, the 5th step would be then to compare what you get as a result from step 2 and step 4 and go for the more conservative approach. Moving to the next slide, please. And, explaining a little bit better these 3 baseline setting approaches that at least 1 and 2 have been existing also for a while out there. It's not, for example, best available technologies approach has been chosen sometimes already. And, it really is set at the level of the most efficient and lowest emission technology. And it's really usually best eligible for those technology-dependent activities like clean cooking technologies or energy-efficient industrial processes. And what is important to mention here, it needs to be updated on a regular basis. Then we have the ambitious benchmark. So you compare against a group of best performing comparable activities, and then it's really also as a policy decision at what level, at what percentile you set that benchmark. And it's best for sectors with homogeneous outputs. And we will need to see what will be the exact guidance also on that percentile you need to set. Then we have the last one, existing emissions adjusted downwards. And this is best for sectors that, have very different outcomes, and like land use, waste management, and this downward adjustment should then reflect the NDC targets and is to be done based on external factors. Jumping to the next slide, we go back into the case study. So over to Hanna.
Thank you. So now remember the efficient AC units and the destruction of refrigerants from old AC units. So first, we would develop a business as usual scenario, which would be, in this case, the continuation of the current situation because there's no policies for moving towards more efficient AC units. So the current situation would continue. And you would calculate how much emissions come from the current situation, make some assumptions, of course, justify those assumptions, take into account the laws and regulations, and be conservative about your assumptions. And then that business as usual is not going to be your crediting baseline. You have to set your crediting baseline below. But how much below? That is the big question, and we don't have the answer here. So one way to do it is by using a discount factor. So you'll have the business as usual, and then you reduce it by, let's say, 10%, 5%, 2%, 50%. How much? It depends on the country. The countries can decide what they accept through their authorization under Article 6.2. How much under PACM? That is still being debated, and that will be eventually decided through the baseline standard and methodologies. And now let's hear from our colleague Mark again on some expert tips on baselines.
For the baseline determination of your activity, first we need to differentiate between Article 6.4, so the PACM, or 6.2. So under the PACM, it's important to follow the PACM requirements. There are specific methodologies approved under PACM, and you need to have PACM approved compatible baseline and monitoring methodologies to use when working in Article 6.4. For Article 6.2, there's more flexibility. There are no specific requirements, at least not from the Article 6.2 rules, which methodologies to use. There are some requirements, for example, that the baseline needs to be below business as usual. And then the countries that are involved in the bilateral agreements, and for example, the buyer country that your project is selling those ITMOs to, and the host country where your country is based, they may have requirements in terms of methodologies to be used. So this is important. Check with the host country, the buyer country, their requirements. When determining the baseline, compared to the clean development mechanism or other voluntary carbon market activities, under Article 6, it's very important that you take the NDC of the host country into account when determining the baseline, checking what is defined in the baseline for your sector. So for the baseline setting below business as usual, there's no guidance, no proper guidance on how to determine below business as usual. So it's not really clear if you have, for example, a cooling project and you have air conditioners, you want to implement those air conditioners in a certain subsector in a country, and you have a specific efficiency level defined as the baseline, or better say as the business as usual scenario. How do you define, how do you kind of what downward adjustment factor do you use? It could be 2% below business as usual, 5% below business as usual. The important thing is that it needs to be well justified why you take this approach. This is really case by case and depends on the technology and the sector.
Great. Well, now I will run through the key requirements for environmental and social safeguards. So under the PACM and under Article 6.2, they both are required to minimize and, where possible, avoid negative environmental and social impacts and contribute to the National Sustainable Development Objectives. But it's important to note that under 6.2, it's the countries who decide how to operationalize these requirements, and this happens through their national criteria. And under the PACM, these requirements are operationalized through the Article 6 Sustainable Development Tool, which is mandatory for all the activities. So if we can move to the next slide, the Article 6.4 Sustainable Development Tool covers three main areas. So it covers environmental and social safeguards, sustainable development impacts and assessment, and validation and verification. And it sets requirements for these three main areas throughout. So if we can jump to the next slide, we have a nice overview of the flowchart that you can see and that you can read in the 6.4 Sustainable Development Tool document. And this tool really helps and guides the project developers step by step to implement the 6.4 Sustainable Development Tool. So we can see the safeguards area, the sustainable development impacts, and also the validation and verification area, and how these requirements that the Sustainable Development Tool set can be complied with by the project developers. And just a quick mention of the environmental and social safeguards areas. There are 11 So next slide, thank you. There are 11 under the tool, and we have a clear division now of what comes in environmental and social, on the social areas. We have a 1-minute video of the expert advice. So can we, yes, great. Let's see if we can play the video. Thanks.
During the CDM times, there were no requirements for environmental and social safeguards, nor there was a grievance mechanism procedure in place. This was problematic because some projects actually generated negative impacts, as it was the case of the Panama Barro Blanco Dam project. The market has learned, and standards on the Article 6 decision now require to have provisions to mitigate potential negative impacts. Last year, the supervisory body adopted the 6.4 Sustainable Development Tool, which is shaping up to be the new point of reference for safeguards requirements. For example, the tool introduces key advancements such as the need to develop a risk management plan with clear indicators that also need to be monitored, and has a strong emphasis on FPIC and equitable benefit sharing for indigenous peoples. Because of this, it is a good option for participating countries in 6.2 cooperative approaches, also to rely on or to use as a basis the 6.4 safeguards, as they not only offer stronger requirements, but also have a more comprehensive monitoring process in place.
Great, thank you. And now, yes, we have time for you and to hear and read out your questions. So now I invite my colleagues, Julie and Hannah, to also come in and we can start answering some questions live.
Yeah, thank you. There are many interesting questions. Let's see what we can answer. So one of the first questions I would like to clarify is, there is existing PACM methodologies, and the answer currently is no. So one could submit already methodologies to the supervisory body currently, but since this operationalization, this breaking down these high-level requirements to the more practical lower level so that one actually understands what is fully meant with it, since this is still ongoing, like I guess many activity participants or other entities, because every entity could submit a methodology to the supervisory body, are holding back, basically are waiting, no? But there different organizations are working on 6.4 methodologies. And then once these are submitted, we will also see how the supervisory body and the methodological expert panel that will support the supervisory body with, approving these methodologies, how they will react to certain justifications and choices made in those methodologies. Because there were many, questions about, okay, I could now go for this performance-based approach, or I could go for these, what to choose. In the end, also, as our colleague Mark pointed it out, it will come back a lot to providing the right and clear justification why certain choices have been made, and then to see the reaction from the MEP and supervisory body, how they react to it and whether they approve or come back, etc. When are we expecting the first methodologies? This is a wild guess here, but many experts saying out there that we expect them towards mid-end of this year. So I guess this remains to be seen. Do my colleagues want to add or take another question in the meantime? I read some concerns about in multiple questions about this being like overly stringent, and that one has to carefully balance environmental integrity and also investor benefits, so to say. I mean, obviously, at the same point of time, I guess everybody being here in this call, is working also in carbon markets, and we have seen also that there is a need for more integrity, and the PACM and is trying to provide this, and other carbon crediting programs are aligning with it, or are choosing their own Paris alignment path, so to say. So I guess there is a need for more environmental integrity, and yes, at the same time, you always need to manage that delicate balance, no? That investors still find it worth investing, so to say. I don't know whether Hanna wants to add to this.
Well, I agree it's a delicate balance. And I think this is one of the requirements where we want to encourage ambition. And if you have a country with very low ambition, everything kind of is additional there. But that's not really where we want to go. We want to encourage ambition. And also remembering that all of the stringency of the baseline, whatever is not credited, actually typically will count towards the host country's NDC. So it's not lost. It is just shared between the host country and what is then transferred outside. I noticed there was a question on, in the context of a positive list, is a corresponding adjustment mandatory? I think there's two things. And then also whether then is there mechanisms under the Paris Agreement for corresponding adjustments? First of all, they're sort of separate. The Paris PACM also talks about corresponding adjustments, but it's the same corresponding adjustments that actually happen under Article 6.2. It gets a bit confusing, but there's no corresponding adjustments under the PACM. The PACM is about crediting, generating carbon credits, called Article 6.4 ERs. And then you can go and ask for corresponding adjustments under the Article 6.2. There's different types of lists, and that will be confusing, and we'll have in the next part a little bit having a look at those lists. Countries have lists on what they're willing to correspondingly adjust, so authorize as ICMOs. They also have lists on what they might approve under PACM. They might be same list, they might be a little bit different. But generally, if we think about the host country and the part of the NDC that they plan to achieve on their own without any carbon credits, then that's the new baseline. That's the new business as usual. And the activities have to go beyond that. It could be in terms of activity types, but it could also be that the first amount of certain activities or certain types of activities will be counted towards the NDC. And if you do more than that, then it could be additional. So it's not a clear-cut thing. So even though these positive lists are useful, you shouldn't just blindly look at them and say, if you're on the list, you're fine. That's only sort of indication of the areas where there is potential to do more than what is in the NDC. So that was one of the questions I picked up. Do you guys have some others? And I think we're almost at the time anyway.
Yeah, perhaps one question was on, how to interpret the evolving guidance on dynamic baselines under 6.4. Specifically, how will the use of dynamic baselines impact project viability and predictability? And perhaps a response to that is, some out there would say, okay, it's not necessarily a dynamic baseline because you basically know prior to that the quantitative downward adjustment approach. So there's going to be clear guidance, hopefully, in the next standard on baselines, and there might be a specific downward adjustment tool also in the near future. So that's something on top that the supervisory body is planning to provide. So you will have certainty in terms of how you need to quantitably downward adjust it per year. So a little bit more of certainty there than if you entirely go with dynamic baselines and do not know in the end how economic trends will develop, etc. Good, and I think with this, since it's already 3 p.m., I guess we would launch the next poll and then, give everybody, while responding to the poll, a little bit of time to have a breather. Over to you, Cynthia, for the poll.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Yeah, this is a poll to start section 3 or the part 3 of this masterclass. And in this section 3, we're going to be navigating the Article 6 process. So putting together all of what we have already explained to you, so requirements and Article 6.2, 6.4. So how do you actually develop projects and how can you actually develop projects under these 6.2, 6.4, even under other carbon creating programs? So this is what we will be looking at in this session. First of all, let's hear what you have to answer to our next set of questions. So if we can start jumping into the questions and answers, that would be great. So once you scan the QR, you're going to see the first question. And for this one, we have, as a project developer, which option would you be interested in exploring? So please select only one. And in the options, we had generating ITMOs, generating Article 6.4 ERs under the PACAM, or both of the above. And we can see that both of the above is by far the most popular option here. So we have our participants would like to or would be interested in exploring and developing projects that can generate ITMOs and that can also generate 6.4 ERs under the PACAM. Great. But yeah, it's also interesting to see that generating ITMOs only 6%. So project developers, if you were a project developer, it would be less interesting to only generate ITMOs. Can we look at the responses for a second question? Great, thank you. So now, as a project developer, what would be your most important consideration? And here again, we have, we ask you to drag up and down your preferred option. The top one is the most important. And here for our project developers of the day, we have that selecting a carbon crediting buyer at an early stage would be the most important thing, and this to reduce uncertainties. Then the second highest or most important consideration that you would have is selecting a host country with high Article 6 readiness. The third popular option was selecting a carbon credit buyer at a later stage to increase potential unit price. And at the end, we have selecting a host country with low national fees. So here, it's most important that the project developers reduce their uncertainties when investing in a project, and also make sure that host country that they are developing the project in has a high Article 6 readiness. So those were the most important considerations for the audience today. And now, looking at the time, I think we can already start with the content of this part 3. And I will hand over to Yuli.
Yes, thank you. So we're looking at navigating the Article 6 process. And what we will see on the next slides is that host countries play a central role under Article 6. And what we have heard also now multiple times already is when you develop design activities, you need to watch out for host country requirements, but also buyer requirements. For example, we will see on the next slides, Switzerland has certain buyer requirements as well. So you need to watch out what activities you are developing and whether they are of interest. And same with Sweden. No. Also, the requirements vary across countries. Like also in regional contexts, like West Africa, countries have very different requirements. And these you can usually find in carbon market frameworks, laws, policies, and one needs to check up carefully. And yeah, there's also support provided in terms of analysis of those host country requirements. Gold Standard is also providing a knowledge product there, for example. So checking those is essential. And it's also important to consider potential use cases and buyers already at the design stage, so that you also, make sure that you meet your buyer's interest. On the next slide, we see a very generic carbon crediting cycle. I think we can click through it relatively quickly because you are all familiar with it. You see where project developers come in, initial screening, activity design, then we have independent third-party entities for the validation, and then later on for the verification of achieved mitigation outcomes. And yes, the program operator here is registering the activity and then in the end also issuing it. And stakeholder engagement across all of these steps is very essential. When we now dive on the next slide in the PACM carbon crediting cycle, so similar process here. The documents might be called a little bit different, but actually also under the PACM, we have the project design documentation, so PDDs. So initial screening, then activity design, validation, registration. So these are all the same steps, but now the host country plays also an important role. First of all, host country criteria. Also under Article 6.4, the host country can actually communicate to the supervisory body certain methodological requirements, like when it comes to additionality, but also baselines or standardized baselines. And one would need to watch out for this communication from host countries to the supervisory body. So far, I haven't seen any in this regard, but it's also something to watch out for, and for sure will happen in the future as well. And one needs the approval of the host country of the activity. This is different from authorization, so don't mix this up, but the host country needs to provide approval and ensure that the activity, is aligned with the host country's visions, so NDCs, but also SDG strategies. Now, with the Article 6.2 cycle, so when you're generating IPMOs, yeah, thank you. And perhaps already, clicking through, thank you. So also here you can see it all follows the same cycle, but perhaps the terms are a little bit different. We often talk about a main mitigation activity idea node and mitigation activity design document for the PDD. And what is here, as an additional process, what you can see in purple at the top is the host country authorization and first transfer that can be given throughout that cycle that you see here, and potentially even later. That will, as an attribute to the carbon credit. And then also buyer country authorization potentially that could play a role. Some buyers also authorize. But yeah, basically following the same cycle, you would have the registration of the activity by program operators. This is more optional here because potentially you could even go, for a very country-specific approach instead of choosing, for example, a voluntary carbon market crediting program like Gold Standard. But the rest is quite similar. And I mean, what we need to mention here is that potentially before the issuance of IPMOs, of credits, that also there is an examination happening often by both the the host country and the buyer country again. So checking basically the quality and whether it matches against their national criteria. So this is really why you see those purple lines across the entire activity cycle, because it depends on the processes that the host country, and in case there is a buyer country, the host and the country and the buyer country agree upon, and depending on that, you might have different checks along the way. So yeah, this is why you see those boxes on top. Moving to the next slide. We have heard already about concerns about different risks in the chat, in the Q&A. And yes, so, and sorry, now we don't see what is underneath those boxes, but yes, with, yeah, thank you. With the host country authorization. So obviously a risk, and that has been raised in the chat, clicking on the next box, Beatrice, is that also these delays that you could experience. So under 6.4, for example, with the approval of the activity, and also with the authorization under 6.2. So that could really delay this activity development cycle. And yes, that is a risk, but one could also mitigate those risks by, really favoring those countries with high readiness, that follow requirements, that communicate clear timelines, and also through regular engagement with the host party, also to build trust, etc. No? And at the same time, there is this risk of that the host country could revoke. So meaning changing the authorization after the first transfer has actually already happened. And, and then actually the corresponding adjustment might also not be applied. So how to mitigate this risks? And there are now also emerging insurance instruments for this, and Hanna will dive into more details on this. And what I obviously need to mention here as well is it comes with certain costs, and I need to add a disclaimer, like these fees really vary, we provided some ranges, and these slides will be shared, so you can take a look at them in more detail also afterwards. But this is a rough indication, no? And there is an authorization fee sometimes from the host country that you also need to take into account on top of the usual validation verification fee, and also, the costs of actually developing those project documents. Thank you. And I think with this, I'm handing over to Hanna.
Yes, thank you, Yuli. So as you've now certainly learned already, there is different options. And so here's just an exemplary table or illustrative table on different options. So if you want to generate ITMOs for CORSIA use, then in every case, regardless of if you just click backwards and focus on the ITMOs for now. One more click, thank you. Can you click forward once more? Thank you. Here we go. This is a good place to pause, because there's quite a lot of information here. So you want to generate ITMOs. You always need to have host country authorization. You might need to have a buyer country authorization, depending on who's buying. If you're selling to Japan, to Switzerland, Click Foundation, Singapore, Sweden, they will want to authorize. Even if it's officially optional, they will want to authorize anything they buy. If it's voluntary use, you don't really have a buying country, so it's not applicable. You always need the host country authorization if you want to generate ITMOs. Now, do you need a third-party validation? That is actually a requirement. ITMOs need to be verified. But who is that third party? That depends. For CORSIA, it needs to be under an eligible program. CORSIA has particular carbon crediting programs, you have to use them. And then you also have to get the registration under that program. If you want to sell ITMOs to CORSIA, you have to check and use particular programs. If you sell to Japan, you will have to use Japan's own program, which is called the JCM. There's many of them. If you sell for CLIC, you can actually quite flexibly choose different kind of methodologies and combination of methodologies, and they'll be approved by then CLIC in Switzerland and the buying country. And similarly for Singapore and Sweden, they don't require a particular program to be used. And for voluntary use, yeah, it depends on the buyer as well. So do they require actually using a program? Okay, so that's it for ITMOs. Now, if you want to generate Article 6.4 ERs under the PACM, so that's the next clicks, and you want them to be authorized as ITMOs, you have to tick both the ITMO box and the PACM box. So you always need the host country approval for PACM. You'd have to have an authorization if you want an ITMO, but if you want an MCU, you don't need it, and you actually shouldn't have one. It doesn't make sense. Bioauthorization doesn't make sense for PACM. Actually, if you want to sell ITMOs from PACM to Sweden, you actually do require bioauthorization as well. And then you would need to use verifiers under the PACM and use all of the requirements and registration under the PACM by definition. So you would need to know who you're selling to, for what purpose, to actually know which route to take. So this is the lesson of this particular slide. And now to the next slide, please. So here are some tips for initial screening. So before you really launch this process, it would be very advisable to have a check, an initial check on your technical and financial feasibility, which is just basic in project development. Then check for applicable approved methodologies, because that might influence your choice. Maybe methodologies aren't available in PACM, so that will maybe influence some of your choice to go to PACM or something else that actually has already available methodologies, because developing a new methodology is an other process and it's a costly one. Then a rough calculation of emission reduction potential using the methodologies. And typically you'd have a document called the project idea note or the mitigation activity idea note main, where you would have these rough calculations. Then you would have to look at, or you would be advised to look at the host country's Article 6 readiness. As you already said in your polls, you would like to have countries with high readiness and understand their requirements and understand their processes to really decide whether you're going to launch your process. And then look at your activities relationship with that host country's NDC. Is it part of it? Is it additional to it? How is it related to the NDC? And whether there's some eligibility lists in the host country. Does your activity show up on those lists? And then already at an early stage, it's advisable to identify buyers and what they're actually going to use them for and what are their criteria and procedures. So you can already design your project also thinking about your buyers. And then if they need carbon crediting programs, you also have to take that layer into account on what carbon crediting programs will require from you. You'd have to use their methodologies rather than some others. Then it would be good to start reaching out initially to the host country and potential buyers, and then answer some questions. Are you seeking authorization as ITMOs under Article 6.2? Do you want to go for PACM? Do you want to go for another program? Do you want to sell to specific buyers? So these are things you should start thinking about already when you're at an early stage. Next slide, please. And now if we're looking at the case study on the air conditioning units, there are several different methodologies. There's one approved methodology under CDM. There's another one approved under the Verified Carbon Standard. And then there's one approved under the Climate Action Reserve. Now, if you were to want to combine these, then that can be a bit complicated. Some countries for ITMOs allow it. You wouldn't be able to do that on a PACM. You would have to use PACM methodologies which don't exist yet. So this particular case study couldn't be registered under PACM just yet. We'd have to wait for the methodologies to come or put them forward. And then if you would want to sell from this project to CORSIA, you would need to use only those methodologies that are approved by one eligible carbon crediting program that you choose. So you couldn't mix for one methodology from one program and another from another. you would need to then use only methodologies approved by the program you're using. And if you don't have them on offer, then you would need to propose new methodologies for the PACM. That's costly and time consuming. Or then ask for revision to existing ones if you want to expand their scope. So it gets complicated when you have methodologies that you want to mix and match. So that was the moral of this slide. Next slide, please. I think we can move quite quickly from these examples, but yeah, go ahead, Cynthia.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. In the next 2 slides, we're going to look at some real-life examples of mitigation activity via nodes or mains, and we're going to be looking at the content. So we have an example here of the triple GI main template, and they identify 4 key areas. They have a section for the activity overview information, a greenhouse gas emission reductions information. So project developers filling out this template should explain how relevant creating mechanisms or the relevant creating mechanism that has been chosen, the demonstration of additionality, baseline setting, estimated emission reductions, etc. Then they also require this main to include information on financing. So how does the financing will be secured, the financing needs of the activity and other incentives, and overall implementation arrangements. So looking at how the activity or the project developer is engaging with the stakeholders, safeguards compliance, and technical and financial arrangements. Then for the next example, we have the template of the Click Foundation. And this template is a little bit more simple. The contents are in general the same, because really the main point of a main is that it includes the necessary basic information for host countries and buyers to consider their initial interest in the activity. So when a project developer provides the basic information of the activity, key facts, the participating entities, and other relevant information, then this is a way in which host countries can look at the document and decide or start giving hints on their interest in the activity. So, and if we, yeah, thank you, great. Some host countries have shown really a good level of Article 6 readiness up to now. And these are just a list of examples of early movers. So under Article 6.2, we have countries as Peru, Dominican Republic, Cambodia, Vietnam, and these are the countries that have already set national arrangements and have already communicated certain or a number of bilateral agreements under which IDMOs can be authorized and transferred. Then in the PACM, we have also certain countries that have already submitted the participation requirement for it, and these include Chile, Ghana, for example, Morocco, Myanmar, etc. So Article 6 readiness under 6.2 refers to the national frameworks that the countries have already set or have in place. And then for the PACM is more about whether they have submitted the participation requirements form, have they already set an eligibility list, have they set already some requirements for the methodologies that the activities implemented in the country must follow or not, etc. So if we jump to the next slide, please. Then we can have more examples into a host country's eligibility criteria for IDMOs. So this is the example of Ghana, and Ghana has some three criteria, for example. So we have that the activity that seeks authorization needs to be in the conditional part of the NDC, needs to be in the whitelist, and needs to meet the criteria of the buyer. So the whitelist for Ghana means that the activity that is in this whitelist is eligible for automatic approval. And these activities and technologies must then be conditional in the NDC contribute to sustainable development and demonstrate environmental integrity and comply with applicable technologies in the latest approved CDM positively. So when developing a project developers should check these national requirements because they differ across countries. So this is Ghana's example, but then if we move forward in the next slide, we have Thailand's eligibility criteria for ITMOS. And for Thailand, they defined project characteristics and they also define eligible activity types. So in the project characteristics, they say that mitigation has to be in addition to the national mitigation plans. It has to support NDC and the long-term low carbon development achievement, etc. And they have a very clear list of eligible activity types that can request authorization. So renewable energy, increased efficiency activities, public transportation system, etc. Then for the PACM, we have also some examples. Can we move to the next slide, please? Great. For the PACM, we have examples of host country activity lists. So Ghana has clearly defined that they will allow activities to be registered under the PACM that are involved in e-mobility, low carbon hydrogen, waste management, etc. For India, they also have a list of prioritized activity types. It's a little bit longer than the other two countries that we have in this slide. So they look at renewable energy, green hydrogen, compressed biogas, and Bhutan has a shorter, less defined list and less specific list. So once again, this is a reminder that when developing a project, really what you should check first is the national requirements because they will differ country by country, and activity developers need to comply and need to make sure that they align with these national requirements. So I think it's now time for, yes, our last poll of the session, actually, if I'm not wrong, or I think we have another one coming in, but yeah, we invite you again to scan the QR code and answer the questions that you will be shown. So I think that for these polls, we have actually, yeah, several questions. We have 5 questions that we have posed to you. And great. I will give you some minutes for you to scan the QR code and start responding. So we have 2 responses needed. Maybe we give it some few more seconds to wait for more answers. But this first question reads, what is your view on the following 4 statements? And we have 4 statements. So can we move to the next question, please, Beatrice? Great. So what is your view on host country engagement increases alignment with national targets? Do you fully agree, partially agree, neutral, or fully disagree? So please give some thumbs up on whether you agree or disagree or somewhere in the middle on whether host country engagement increases alignment with national targets. And I think we're slowly seeing that participants agree, almost fully agree, that host country engagement increases alignment with national targets. Can we move to the next question, Beatrice? Great. Thank you. Then for host country engagement increases project quality. So we don't have a strong agreement in this part, and we just remain at 4 thumbs up, which is partially agree. Then for the third question, we want to hear your views about host country engagement increases risk project development. This is really interesting. So people are rather more neutral. So there's not a clear decision on whether host country engagement actually increases or may decrease risk to project development. Great. And the last question to hear about your views is this statement of the lack of host country readiness is a barrier to project development. And yes, we have a tendency of participants of fully agreeing to this statement. For the last question, we want you to think as yourself as a host country representative. So if you were a host country representative or a host country, what would be your most important considerations to provide authorizations? And here we ask you again to rank it. And the first and most important consideration is proposed project provides funding for NDC implementation. Then the second most preferred or most important consideration would be proposed project supports long-term transition to net zero. Then the least favorites are that the project provides sustainable development benefits and does not have significant negative environmental and social impacts. Great, thank you so much for your responses. This is really interesting to hear, and I think that now we can jump back to the presentation.
Thanks. On the next 2 slides, I would have gone into some buyer eligibility criteria, like, for example, Click Foundation. I'm not going to run through those in detail because time is running and we really want to take up some of your questions. But please take a look at these in detail when this presentation is shared. On the next slide, for example, we have Singapore's criteria that one would need to take into account. Interesting here is, for example, that Singapore is asking for a 5% fee of ITMOs to support adaptation and 2% for overall mitigation and global emissions. So here, basically, reflecting 6.4 requirements. And then moving on, there was also a question on this in the chat. What are these different letters that host countries might have? And Ghana has a a very elaborate carbon market framework and has also shared different templates for pre-approval letters. There is a letter of intent to confirm alignment with the NDC and sustainable development. There is also an excerpt of this so that you can look at it in detail. Then there is a letter of endorsement and to recognize voluntary carbon market developers as well. A letter of assurance, like sort of a pre-authorization and confirmation of automatic additionality if the mitigation activity is on Ghana's whitelist. And then the letter of recommendation that precedes basically the validation and also initiates the authorization process. Going on to the next slide, some key steps, basically summarizing also, mitigation activity design, document development, and then the validation. Many of these recommendations have been made. I want to highlight again, provide transparent and credible justifications and evidence, because this will also be relevant for the validation process, and provide those information that are really needed, and avoid going a lot into different details that might not be needed. So include only necessary information, and also plan for costs and timelines, and for engagement, for back and forth. with the host country, with the buyer, but also with local and global stakeholders that need to provide input into the activity design. And then for the validation itself, the third-party entity should make sure that the host countries and buyers' requirements are also met, and really check the validators' guidance and processes. And also the validators need to familiarize themselves currently with Article 6 requirements. So it might require some interaction here as well. And with this, I'm already handing over to Hanna.
Yeah, here's a slide on some examples on the MAD contents, but it's basically just headings on the different aspects we've been talking about, and other aspects. We haven't covered everything. And then moving on to some points about authorization. So first of all, the authorization can happen in different times. And to be authorized, you will need to meet the requirements of the host country and of the buyer if you need their authorization. The timing could be at different points, and so that's good to take into account. Typically, it's after validation, but before issuance. So then the country has enough information to actually make an informed decision about authorization. But then once you start transferring things without knowing whether it's an ITMO or not, it gets more problematic. And you do need to reserve time for the national assessment. There might be back and forth information requests as well. And then authorizations can often come with conditionalities. They might come with costs. You might have a fee. And then there's risks. So if you have an early authorization, it might be conditional to successful registration, verification, things like that. And final checks like Yuli was mentioning. There might be some fees in some host countries. They might be used for NTC implementation or for something else. There's also a risk that the host country might revoke or cancel the authorization, or other risks that they don't respect the authorization. They don't make the transfer, or they don't apply the corresponding adjustments. And typically the project developer will then bear these risks and can take insurance. And if you want to have ITMOs for CORSIA, you actually need to be insured. And the market is now providing some of these insurance products. So the next slide, please. So here is an example of an authorization letter, and it says who it's authorized for and for how many years. There was a question on how long, and so the period is here. For now, this example is until the end of December 2030, and it typically needs to be in the same NTC implementation period. And if you click again, there's actually some other quotes. And here are some conditions from this real life authorization letter. It says this authorization is conditional to the successful issuance under the designated registry of Thailand, for example, and implementation in line with Thailand's requirements. So if you break those requirements, your authorization may be revoked according to this letter. And then moving on. Here is an example, very recent example from last week. There is the World Bank's Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, MIGA, has issued a guarantee to manage corresponding adjustment risks for a project. And that makes them able to sell these to CORSIA, eligible for CORSIA, which requires very strong insurance against these risks, against double claiming risks. So these are emerging at the moment. And then moving on, since time is precious and we want to get to your questions, some tips on activity implementation. These are pretty much the same as before. You need to monitor and report. But remember, not only the project mitigation, but also environmental and social aspects. Verification, again, takes time, and there might be time needed to go back and forth. Engagement with the host country and buyer, especially if you had conditions about verification, you have to let them know, okay, now I've met these conditions. Can you now transfer it? And then if there's some changes, then you have to go through the approval process of your chosen program. And then on the next slide, if I remember correctly, there's a few slides that we put together for you. Here's an example to just say that it's possible. So this was the first project ever to receive an authorization from Ghana. and with a buyer, Quick Click Foundation, so a authorization also from Switzerland. Promotion of climate smart agricultural practices and rice cultivation. So here are some steps on what happened. So in the early stage, they needed a main to register and apply with Click. They needed a letter of intent from Switzerland and Ghana to be pre-selected by Click. And if you click once more, that pre-selection allowed them to move to the activity design and the MAD stage. And based on the MAD, then Ghana gave a letter of recommendation and contract negotiations started. And that letter of recommendation means validation can proceed. And after validation, it got letters of authorization, the first ones ever, from Switzerland and Ghana. And Ghana also reported in its initial report to the Paris Agreement on this particular project. And that way it's become an authorized project. And in the next steps, there's going to be verification, examination, and then there's the first transfer, and it's finally a ITMO. And then on the next slide, there are some numbers, but if you click a couple of times, the important thing here is that the way they've set the baseline below business as usual, as is reported in the initial report, is that you count the business as usual baseline, and then there is a conservativeness factor of 0.89, and that adjusts the baseline below business as usual. And there was also some examples of what kind of sustainable development benefits this rice cultivation project provided. So training, gender equality, and water management. And there was a combination of IPCC default factors and CDM methodologies, and there wasn't any particular carbon crediting program used in this particular project. So this example is just to show that it is possible and it's doable, although I can understand that it feels a bit overwhelming at times. And now moving on to some tips from our colleagues. And in the interest of time, we'll go straight to Dani's slide. So the next one, I think. Here we go. Let's give the floor to Dan.
Developing a successful Article 6 mitigation activity requires careful planning. Here are key lessons learned from my past experiences that I would like to share with you today. First, keep the scope simple. While a multi-component project might seem appealing, it can complicate baseline setting and additionality testing. Also, engage with the host country government early to ensure alignment with national priorities and regulatory additionality. Financial planning is another crucial aspect. Consider required investments and co-funding sources in advance. Another important factor is the timeline. Project development can take significantly longer if stakeholder engagement is weak or data availability is limited. Identify potential risks for delays early and mitigate them, especially regarding robust data collection. Next, a solid baseline is key. Carefully assess existing methodologies to ensure they fit both the host country context and the specific mitigation activity. Article 6 adjustments may be needed, such as setting the baseline below business as usual. Finally, robust data collection is essential for credible baseline setting and future MRV processes. Make sure your dataset is well documented and representative. Lastly, validation can be streamlined by following any guidance provided by the host or buyer country and incorporating it early in your documentation. Equally important is establishing a common understanding of the project approach with the validator. Proactively addressing open questions helps resolve issues quickly and avoids unnecessary delays. By keeping the project scope manageable, ensuring a strong and conservative baseline, and preparing well for validation, you can significantly improve the chances of a successful Article 6 mitigation activity. Thanks for watching.
Yes, I can take over now, and this is actually now the last poll that we have for the session. It's coming to an end, so we would like to hear these last thoughts from you. And please, if you can go ahead and scan the QR code, we can then jump into the questions and see what your last thoughts are. And this is a set of questions of only 4 statements again, where we ask about your view on this statement. So again, whether you fully agree or fully disagree, or you're somewhere in the middle. So let's see. The first statement, and probably I will also allow some seconds for responses to come, but I can already start reading the first one. So, what is your view? What do you think? Article 6 increases mobilization of climate finance. So, do you fully agree? Do you disagree? After hearing this presentation, what's your take and what's your idea and perception? We have responses are coming, and we can see that we have a partly agree audience that Article 6 increases mobilization of climate finance. Can we skip to the next question, please? The next question, or the next statement that we have, is Article 6 increases demand for carbon credits and ITMOs. So again, we have an audience that partly agrees with this statement. So Article 6 might increase demand for carbon credits, and this is the perception of the room. Then for the third question, or the third statement, we have Article 6 increases supply for carbon credits and ITMOs. Let's see what the participants say. And yeah, again, we have a audience. So we haven't had a fully agree answer as we had before. And then for the fourth question, Article 6 increases trust in the integrity of carbon credits and ITMOs. Again, partly agree. So the perception is it can actually probably increase trust in the integrity of carbon credits and ITMOs. Now we're going to go into the last part of our session, completely to wrap up.
We'll have some questions and answers first, so maybe a few slides backwards. So we still have some time for questions. Here we go.
Yes.
Actually, since I'm speaking, I might as well take the first one, which I noticed here before Yuli takes over the questions she's picked. I noticed that there is this question about, there's been very little in this webinar about nature-based solutions. And that's a very valid point. Let me see if I can talk with the camera now that we're not sharing. And that is a valid point. And we haven't looked deeply into a particular standard that has also been approved under the PACM, which is the removal standard. And there are any activities, whether emission reductions or removals, that have a risk of a reversal, they need to meet extra requirements in that removal standard. So those interested in nature-based solution development under the PACM should look at the removal standard. And there is lots of requirements there, and there's going to be more detailed requirements developed later in the methodologies. But in general, nature-based solutions are possible as long as you can fully address any risks of reversals and non-permanence through buffer pools and things like that. And there needs to be a risk assessment of that. So it's a topic for an entire webinar, and that's why we didn't go into there. But in general, it is possible. It needs to meet the requirements, and it needs to meet extra requirements regarding permanence. And in terms of 6.2, there is a general requirement that risk of any reversals need to be fully addressed, full stop. So however countries decide to implement this then is up to them, as always is the case with Article 6.2. So in both Article 6.2 and PACM, it is possible and welcome to do nature-based solutions, but you can expect, especially under PACM, to be quite strict on the types of requirements for fully addressing reversals. Now, Julie, have you picked up some questions while I was picking up on the MBS thing?
Yes, there's so many. Let me pick up on an authorization question. So somebody asked, there's new guidance for 6.2, and that specifies 3 levels of authorization of a cooperative approach, of an entity, and of mitigation outcomes. How does this work in practice? And based on the activity cycle, at what point do countries authorize entities, for example? So yes, that's absolutely right that at COP29, some further guidance was adopted, and it was said there are these 3 different types of authorization. And what we see in practice, or have seen also before that guidance existed, is that in the authorizations that hosts and also buyer countries, if they provided one, that basically they already differentiated between these, or at least mentioned which entity they authorize and what's the name of the cooperative approach that they authorize, and the mitigation outcomes. So that did not become very clear from the authorizations that we shared. But I need to say, it's up to the host when to do an authorization and how exactly. There is this voluntary template that hosts can use. And potentially also, the buyer country if they want to, but it's a host country authorization template, and that has also 3 different sections with the elements, and COP29 specified very clearly what needs to be the content of an authorization, and then, these contents are then basically allocated to these 3 different sections. And yeah, the template has been actually published last week, a template provided by the UNFCCC Secretariat. So we will, I guess, see some alignment also for already existing authorizations out there that have also then, for example, in gold standards registry, etc. There's also a separate sheet sometimes on double checking with the host country certain things. So probably what we will see is also an alignment of authorizations. Actually, the authorizations that exist out there need to make sure that they reflect all the contents that have been agreed upon at COP29. And most host countries might use that voluntary template. Let's see, it's voluntary in using in its nature. Anna, do you have another question you want to pick?
Yeah, there was one short one here. Let's take a short one. In case of Article 6.2 and you don't have a program, carbon crediting program, who does the issuance? And I've been actually trying to figure that out, because issuance is not mentioned very many times in the rules. And if you don't have a carbon credit issued underlying an ICMO, then you would issue it in your national registry. If you are not using a national registry, you're using the international registry and account there, you can request as a special function issuance of ICMOs directly into the international registry. But the international registry assumes that the issuance happens somewhere else. And if it doesn't, then you can issue it even in the international registry. So it could be the national, like in the Thailand case, the issuance actually happens in the Thai registry by Thai authorities. So that's one quick question there. And then there was a question about if you don't want ICMOs, you just want MCUs under the PACM, what is the host country's role in that case? And then the answer is that it would need to be approved by the host country, and would be need to be in the list of host country approvals. And over to you, Julie, if you have a question.
Yes, there's a question. To keep our option open as a project developer, how can we verify our mitigation outcome with both national standards aligned with PACM for ICMOs, while also use other carbon crediting programs such as Gold Standard for voluntary contribution? How to prevent the need for double auditing, which is very costly? Yes, that's a valid question. I guess, as we have shown on various slides, like you can go for the carbon crediting program you choose. It doesn't matter in the end. You need to get it validated independently, and then could seek authorization later on. So you could choose a validator. So you always need what path do you need to go first. So if you want to issue Article 6.4 emission reductions in the end, then you need to sort of align with the 6.4 requirements and need to make sure you meet them. Same with the national one. So I guess you sort of need to pick your path if you don't want to avoid going back and forth and risking not aligning with certain requirements. So make your choice, and you could potentially often go for more stringent choices than that mostly then aligns with most requirements in the end, instead of going for very lenient and then realizing that many have more stringent requirements at the national level and you don't meet those, and then you need to go back to the project documentation and need to start again. Hanna, you want to add here?
I would just sort of, first of all, you can't double register. So there's different ways of double counting. We haven't gone into it today, but one double counting is double registration. So you have to pick, as Yuli said. Ideally, in the perfect world, it wouldn't matter what you pick because everything's perfect and everything meets the same criteria. But we're not in the perfect world, so you need to pick. It might depend on what your buyer wants. And also remember, even if you use gold standard, you could look at the guidance from PACM, and it says you need to set your baselines like this. It can be possible to apply international best practice or stringent approaches, regardless of what you pick. Because there's going to be, even with the PACM, you might have some additional stringent requirements from a particular host country. Ghana will say you'll always have to, might say, haven't said yet. So also, the best advice is, like, if you want to keep your options open, go for the best practice. That's actually one of my wrap-up points as well, where we actually need to go soon. There was actually one question I wanted to still pick on. Okay, so if you do authorization you authorize before issuance, then how can you make sure that the ITMO is verified? Well, that's a very good question. And remember, well, this is half of the answer. Remember that the ITMO needs to be authorized and first transferred. However, if you remember what we were saying, first transfer could be authorization. So if authorization happens before verification, it's actually not verified. And so in that case, if you're a responsible host country and you want to meet the requirements of an ITMO being verified, but you authorize it before verification, you make the authorization conditional to the verification, and that's how you meet that requirement. But as a final point is that host countries are still struggling to think of all these different levels. So project developers should be aware of these requirements, even if no one explicitly requires them from them, and it's not in the EMAD template, it's not required in the application forms and things like that, which is really why you need to know the international good practice, even if no one, the validator, is not requiring it, the host country is, because we're all still learning about all of this and the different levels. But I think with that, it is time to wrap up. We have a couple of minutes left. I'll try to wrap up in 1 minute, and then I will pass on to our host's gold standard. So how to wrap this thing up after 3 hours? Well, first of all, remember, Article 6 operates in the context of really ambitious global goals. This didn't happen before. Until 2021 onwards, we really did not have a global goal for net zero, nothing less. And we're really having that ambition in the background and all the mechanisms working towards that ambition. Before, it was just like, if you do something extra, you get credits. But now we have to remember, we actually have a global goal we need to meet. And the next point is that it operates in a context of national targets in every country. That also wasn't the case until 5 years ago. And those targets, they translate into policies. So you always were required to take policies into account, but there weren't so many policies before. And now with all of these targets, you have a new context, and that brings the reason why we have such a strong host country role. And then thirdly, you have different options. There is a mix of national flexibility and international oversight. And that makes it a bit hard to navigate for sure. But remember, Article 6 is not one thing, it's many things and many opportunities. And a lot of answers to questions is it depends. Fourthly, and this is the final point here, it's that you have multi-level requirements. You have the Paris Agreement having requirements, you have host countries and buyers, and if you want to use the program, then the program has requirements. You have to handle all of them, and that's what comes with Article 6. So final words from my side on the next slide. Yes, it's complicated. You will need expertise, you will need resources, you will need time. And remember that Article 6 is not a guarantee of integrity. It can vary across countries and activities depending on the countries. And for that reason, no one can guarantee integrity on your behalf, unfortunately. So our advice is applying international best practice, even if no one's explicitly requiring it, because it reduces your risks. It increases the likelihood of success. It helps you fetch a price premium, and it will attract a broader basis of buyers. And my final and favorite quote, it always seems impossible until it's done. I use that a lot in my work, and I want you guys to use it too. And it has been done, so it's not impossible, even though it seems like it. And now, with these words, over to you, David.
It always seems impossible till it's done is a good way of describing the task that we gave to Perspectives, which was to try and explain all of Article 6 in 3 hours. I'm going to invite them to come back on screen so we can see them. And this was a real tour de force. It's actually really amazing because for those of you who have been involved in this for some time, I've been following these for years. You know, we have gone from just a few lines in a text in the Paris Agreement to a huge amount of content, and to be honest, complexity as well. And probably if you take that away, or actually there are many things I'll take away from the last couple of hours, but one of them is that this is a genuinely quite complicated system, and it's better not actually to shy away from the complexity. You sort of have to embrace it. And as Hannah said, even people who've been doing this for a while, we're still really learning about this. So certainly I'll take that away. And it's been a good reminder. There's just a couple of things I wanted to mention. So the first was that there were a couple of questions around the role of independent mechanisms. So we talked a lot about the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. Just one note for those of you who are out there, which is that Gold Standard itself has committed to align with the Paris Agreement requirements. And so we actually had a public consultation on aligning our standard with Article 6.4. That is closed, but we expect to publish the results from that soon. So stay tuned. And then you will learn about, for instance, how we are bringing all of the baseline requirements that we went through today and the additionality testing into our own standard. A couple of you asked about a recording. Recording will be made available and you'll be notified automatically. I just want to do a quick plug for our final masterclass. If you've still got energy left to learn, next week we are tackling what for me is a really underserved topic in this whole area, which is financing carbon mitigation projects. So we're getting better at providing information on the technical side. Sessions like today's, but generally speaking, the financial aspect is not well covered generally. So do join us, because I think even people well experienced people in the market will have quite a lot to learn about that. And the final thing is to say it's a huge thank you to our brilliant presenter team. There genuinely are not many people in the world who could give this presentation. There are not enough people who know enough about it to answer all the questions and present what they have. So huge thank you to them for all of the time and effort they put into preparing this workshop and to answering as many questions as we could in the time. We had so many questions, and we hope to see many of you next week. So with that, I'm going to close it and wish you a good rest of the day, wherever you are.
Thank you and bye-bye.